Are you struggling to load your AWS configuration from the file in your home directory? You're not alone. Today, we're going to tackle how to load the config from the AWS directory and make your AWS experience smoother. I totally get it. It can be really frustrating when you read about a feature, but you can't find any clear examples or documentation on how to use it. You're definitely not the only one facing this issue. Here's the specific question we're addressing today. One user asked, how do I load the config from the .aws directory if the AWS SDK load config variable is set? This is a common scenario for many developers working with AWS SDK. So what does it mean to load the config from the .aws directory? When the AWS SDK load config environment variable is set, the SDK will look for configuration settings in the .aws/config file. This can help streamline your AWS setup. And stick around. At the end of this video, I'll share a quick tip that can save you time when working with AWS configurations. To begin loading the configuration from the AWS config file, the user needs to ensure that the environment variable AWS SDK load config is set. This variable tells the AWS SDK to load the configuration from the specified file. Next, the user should create or edit the configuration file located at the path /config. This file contains the necessary settings for the AWS SDK to function properly. After setting the environment variable and configuring the file, the user can now use the AWS SDK in their application. The SDK will automatically load the settings from the config file. Finally, the user should test their setup to ensure that the configuration is being loaded correctly. This can be done by running a simple script that interacts with an AWS service. Fun fact, did you know that AWS was launched in 2006? It has grown to become one of the most popular cloud platforms in the world, helping millions of developers like you. Now let's look at the answers provided by other users. This user suggests that to load the config from the .aws directory, you need to set the environment variable AWS SDK load config. If this variable is set, the SDK will load both the credentials and the config files. You can set this variable after requiring the AWS SDK, but make sure to do it before creating new credentials or refreshing them. The user also points out that the credentials.get method won't work until the session token has expired. So keep that in mind when working with these configurations. That's it for that response. Let's explore another one. This user suggests checking the AWS documentation for loading configurations. They recommend installing the AWS CLI tool and running the command AWS configure in your terminal. This sets up your credentials and config files automatically. They provide an example of how to set the profile in your code using aws.config.credentials. If you're running a script, you can specify the profile with AWS Profile. For CLI commands, use -profile to select the desired profile. Finally, they clarify that when you run AWS configure, it creates both the credentials and config files simultaneously, so you don't need to reference the config file explicitly. Here's that quick tip I promised. Always double-check your .aws config file for typos or incorrect settings. A small mistake can lead to big headaches down the line. And there you have it. You should now be able to load your AWS configuration smoothly. Remember, keeping your config files organized is key. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe for more tips and don't miss our next video where we dive deeper into AWS best practices.